All right, hi everybody. Today I'm gonna touch on the bare basics of animating in Autodesk Maya, and we're gonna just do a simple ball hop animation as an example. We're really not gonna do anything super intense. It's just gonna be the basic principles of working with the graph, with the animation graphs and the timeline, and how to do your timeline and setting keyframes and getting your object to move across the screen. So first off, let's create a sphere to work with. You can scale that up as much or as little as you like. I'm gonna work in the front view of my screen. And as you can see, I've set my workspace up on the top right-hand side of the screen to be in the animation workspace, which gives me this nice graph editor and the timeline below it. It just makes it easier to work with when we start animating. So let's say we want to do a simple like ball hop across the screen. It's just going to go down and it's gonna bounce like this. The first thing you want to do before you do anything is that you want to freeze transformation on your object, and what that's going to do is it's just going to prevent your object from changing shapes when you start doing the squash and stretch and rotation and so on later in the animation. So you're gonna select your object, go to modify and select freeze transformations. Then what you want to do next is you want to shift select translate X, Y and Z on the right hand side in shadow box editor on your screen. You're gonna right click and say key selected, and it's gonna show up as a little red thingy here on the side. I've got my timeline set up with 120 frames. The next thing you want to turn on is going to be auto key, which is this one, this little button with the arrows on the right bottom side of your screen. And basically what that does is it creates a keyframe every time you move your object on a different frame. So if I go to the 6th frame or the 7th frame now and I move my object, you'll see that the timeline gets a little red line over there, which means that a keyframe has been created. So if you move across your timeline, you'll see that the ball moves by itself. Then you're going to go to animation preferences, which is the little running man with the gear on the right bottom side of your screen. You're going to go to animation settings, and by tangents, you want to make sure that your default in tangent is clamped and your default out tangent is stepped. And then you're going to go to your time slider, and you want to make sure that your playback speed is 24 frames per second times 1. And let's just save those preferences. Basically, when you're animating, you get different types of animation, different types of timing. So when something is stepped, basically, like I just showed you, if you move from, say, the 1st frame to your 6th frame or your 7th frame, you'll see that if I slide across the timeline, it doesn't move, like, it doesn't flow from one spot to another. It just kind of appears and reappears, and that is when it steps. It does exactly what it says. It steps from one place to another, and you get different types of movement depending on which tangents you use. You get linear movements, which you will use for something that's a very straightforward, like straight line movement, just like that. And you can use spline movement for something that'll allow your object to decelerate or accelerate in speed depending on the shape of the curve. But we'll get to that when we start getting into our keyframes. The next thing about animating a ball hop is that you need to have some understanding of basic physics. Basically, energy dissipates. So, the ball is going to accelerate as it's moving down. Then when it touches the base or the ground, it's going to lose some of its energy. So when it bounces up again, it's going to bounce up to a lesser height. And because, it's not going to be a perpetual continuing movement. Then to set a keyframe in Maya, you want to press S. And you'll see that in the left bottom side of your screen, in the graph editor that you should have with the animation workspace that we set up, you can now adjust in your timeline everything that is in your channel box editor. You'll see that everything in your channel box editor has lit up with a little red line next to it. What that does, I know I said you turn on auto key to basically set a keyframe. Every time you move your object, it sets a keyframe automatically. But I've noticed some people have trouble with their objects sort of changing shapes, or if you adjust something on one keyframe, it'll adjust it on every single keyframe, and they don't know why. And I think the reason for that is that you've just been setting keyframes using auto key, and that's great, but I don't think auto key isn't necessarily set up to take every aspect of your movement into account. So it doesn't take into account rotation or scaling, and that's why your object is changing across every single frame instead of just sticking to the frame that you wanted it to change on. And that's why it's important to, at least initially, press S so that all of the things in your channel box editor show up in your graph editor. So at least for the first frame, press S to set a keyframe so that you have all of those things in your graph editor. All right, so now we can start to set the movement of our object. So what we're gonna do basically is we're gonna lay out the movement of our object in using clamped animation, so that when you slide across the timeline, it's gonna look like the object just sort of appears and reappears in different parts of the screen instead of moving flowingly. And then we're going to connect our keyframes using tangents, and that'll actually layer out the movement better. So let's set our first keyframe to be over here, and then you can always adjust the timing later on. But let's say at the 12th frame our ball will be down here, right? And as you can see, a little line has been created in our translate Y in the graph editor, because we're only moving the object up and down, so it's only moved in the Y axis. Of course, if you were to move it forward as well, then you can go to translate X in your graph editor and you'll see that it has set a keyframe there as well. Now when you slide across, it kind of, as you can see, just disappears and reappears where it needs to be. So our ball is now kind of hopping at an angle. Let's say 10 keyframes later, on the 22nd keyframe, our ball is up in the air again. It's not as high as it was. You can actually check that in Translate Y. It's not as high as it was, and because it was bouncing at an angle, it is now also moved slightly forward. So if we move across our timeline, if we scrub across our timeline like this, you can see the movement of the ball. And like I said, an object, when it comes into contact with another object, loses some of its energy, or it transfers some of its energy, which is why the ball isn't going to hop at the same height perpetually every time. So it's going to hop a little bit lower with every single bounce. So let's now go 8 frames ahead and move our ball down again and to the right. So if we scrub across our timeline, this is what it looks like now. I'm going to stop it there just for the moment. And I'm gonna have us take a look at our keyframes in our graph editor. So now, as you can see, if you play your sequence, you're just going to basically see the ball appear in a different spot every time, and it's not necessarily going to move. There's no movement behind it. It just sort of appears and reappears. We want it to obviously be a movement, and so we have to connect our keyframes in our graph editor using tangents. Okay, so we're gonna go to sphere. We're gonna click on our sphere in the graph editor so we can see both the movements we currently have at the same time. And we're gonna marquee select our first two frames where the ball is at its highest. We're gonna right click, go to tangents, and say spline. Hopefully, there we go, that's what we need. Then we're gonna marquee select the next two where the ball is at its lowest, and we're going to say linear, because the going up motion is usually a linear motion. Okay, then our next two, again, where the ball has reached its highest height, we're going to right click, marquee select those two frames, right click, and say spline. And then our last one, where the ball is at its lowest again, we're going to marquee select, right click, and say linear. So that when we play it back, it looks like that. Okay, obviously it looks a little funny because I literally only have two bounces going, but you get the idea. And now these things in the timeline can be adjusted. So we don't want it to slow down at the end. It'll be slower at the start and then accelerate again in the end. So let's check that out. Okay, I'm quite happy with that. Okay, so we've connected our translate Y's in linear and spline movements, and we've connected our translate X, so now that's why you can see it moving, smoothly across the board. We did that by clicking on our sphere, by selecting the sphere in our graph editor, and modifying both at the same time. Actually, I think I might change this curve so that it looks a little bit more like that. Let's see. There we go. There we go. That's better. Okay. So the next thing you may want to look at is the rotation of the ball. And you want to do that before adding squash and stretch, because, if you add squash and stretch beforehand and then you rotate, it's going to change the way the ball actually looks, and it may not be squashing and stretching in quite the way you want it to anymore, which is pretty important. So let's go to rotate Z or rotate Z in our graph editor, and then you can edit this specifically. And you can also remember you can insert values in your channel box editor to make it more precise. So let's say that between the first and the 12 keyframe, we want there to be a 360 rotation. So we're gonna go to our 12 keyframe, go to our channel box editor, and in rotate Z say 360, right? Supposedly then what it'll do is if you scrub across your timeline, you'll see them all falling and rotating exactly 360 degrees. Then from our 12 keyframe, and if you want to skip from one keyframe to the next, on your keyboard you can press little greater than or smaller than keys just above the spacebar and the Alt key on your keyboard. And that'll allow you to just move seamlessly and precisely from one keyframe to the next. So then we can go to our next keyframe, which mine happens to be the 22nd frame. So let's say from the 12 keyframe to the 22nd, we want there to not be a 360 degree rotation. Let's say we want a 180 degree rotation. Then supposedly if you scrub across your timeline, you'll see a 360 degree rotation in the first bounce and supposedly a 180 degree in the next. Now, it's important to remember that your keyframes haven't been connected yet, necessarily. Your keyframes haven't necessarily been connected in your graph editor as they should be, which is why you may not see a rotation immediately. So let's see if I change this. If I select and right click and say linear from one keyframe to the next, let's see if that changes anything. And it does. So now we have a 360 degree rotation from the first to the 12th frame and a 180 degree rotation from the 12th to the 22nd frame. And let's say by the 30th frame I wanted to have rotated 90 degrees. So let's go to the 30th frame on your timeline, go to your channel box editor and insert 90 degrees in your rotate Z. Right click in the timeline in the previous keyframe, go to tangents, let's make it linear just for argument's sake. And then as you can see from the 22nd keyframe, from the 22nd frame to the 30th, you can see the ball actually just rotating at a 90 degree angle. And this is as far as I've animated. So now if we play it back, you can see our ball falling and rotating. Okay. Obviously you can change. So I usually like to coordinate my graph settings across the board for translate, scale, and rotate. So, for all my high points, I would right click, go to tangents and make it spline. And then for the lower points, I'll right click tangents and make it linear. For the high points, again, I'll make it spline. And the low points, again, I'll make linear. Just so that the ball rotates in the same kind of way as it moves, if that makes any sense. So now we've got this ball hopping, and that's cool, but it doesn't really have any character. So now we may want to add a little bit of squash and stretch. And this is where it comes in handy to add in precise sort of inputs for your rotation, because you can kind of rig it so that, for example, here where I made it move 360, so if I scale it now, it's going to be an easy, it's going to be very easy, like down type of thing. I don't have to work at weird angles to make it look the way it should look. So, obviously you can make a ball hop animation look super cartoony, but just for the start, for argument's sake, we're gonna go ahead and say that for as long as the ball is in the air, it's going to have its original shape. Only once it touches the ground is it going to squash ever so slightly. Then as soon as it's back in the air, it's going to be, it's going to return to its original shape. And all the while it's in the air, it's going to hold that shape until it touches the ground again and it squashes. And obviously you can, play around with how much it squashes, because it's going to change. Again, the higher the bounce, the more the ball's going to accelerate and the more it'll squash. So, as your ball kind of moves on, so this bounce will have a lot of squash. This one will have slightly less because the ball didn't bounce as high as the previous time. It's just a little exercise in the dissipation of energy. So let's start adding our squash and stretch, and this is where it's important that you froze transformations right at the start, because that's gonna help the ball keep its shape at every specific keyframe. Right, so like I said, for all the while that the ball's in the air, it's gonna have its original shape. So let's go to the first keyframe where it actually touches the ground, which in my case is the 12th keyframe. We're gonna go to the 12th keyframe and we are just going to simply squash our little ball. And obviously move it down if my pivot isn't set. Supposedly your pivot should be set to the bottom of the ball because gravity. But my pivot is still in the middle of the ball. So every time I squash it, I need to move it down so that it is actually still at floor level to compensate for the fact that my pivot isn't properly set. And then if you go to, I think it should be scale Y, you can see how our ball squashes as it approaches the ground. Now the problem here is that the ball squashes mid-air, which isn't realistic. And for that reason, we need to add a keyframe just before the ball hits the ground, where it still has its original shape. So I'm gonna quickly undo this keyframe that I set. And we're gonna go to the frame just before the ball actually hits the floor, and we are going to add a keyframe here. Then we're going to go to the next frame, which is where the ball hits the ground, and we're going to squash it on this frame, right? Move it down, there we go. Then we're going to go to the place where our ball, its maximum height again, and we're going to go to your channel box editor, and wherever you scaled the ball, you're going to change that value back to 1. And you'll see it resets it to its original shape. And as you can see on your timeline, a keyframe has been created. So now you can see the ball doesn't squash mid-air. It only starts to squash once it hits the ground. And then, it returns to its original shape as it's going up, or supposedly. We still have to connect our keyframes properly. At the moment, it's a clamped movement. All right, so we go to the frame just before the ball hits the ground. We add a keyframe over there where the ball still has its original shape. Then we go to the frame where it hits the ground and we scale it down so that it squashes, this time a little bit less. And we add our keyframe there. All right, so now we want to connect our keyframes properly, so that I think I've only scaled in X and in the X and the Y axes, really, or so it seems. So let's go to scale Y, and like I said, I like to coordinate my graphs. This is just a personal preference. I mean, obviously this is something that can be adjusted, but I like to kind of coordinate the look of my graphs across the board. So wherever it's at a maximum height, I'm gonna select the keyframe, right click, go to tangents, say spline. The next one, right click, where it's hit the ground, I'm gonna select it, right click, and say linear. Even this one, I'll make it spline because it's still in the air, but we'll see. All right, so now we have this. So now if you scrub across your timeline, you can see, as the ball's going up, it has this linear return to its original shape. It doesn't just suddenly change from a squashed ball to a perfectly fine ball. It kind of changes gradually. All right, and then we want to kind of add the same thing. So for maximum height, we're gonna say spline, and then at a minimum height, let's say linear. And now you can see, and now if we play it, you can see kind of this gradual shape. It's very funny the way it ends in this animation. You can't see it as properly because I only have 2 bounces. Obviously, if I added more bounces to it, it would continue to bounce lower and lower, and the squash will continue to lessen and lessen until the ball finally rolls ahead and stops. But for now, you kind of get the idea. And if you go back to perspective view, you can actually watch the ball as it falls. And you can see the rotation and the squash and the stretch even better. And how it all came together in the end. So now, you may not be perfectly happy with the timing of your animation. Me, I'm actually kind of happy with the timing of my frames. But if you weren't, there is a way to adjust this even after you've done all your animations. So, if you wanted to change the timing of your animation, you can marquee select the area that you want, where you want your keyframes to be closer together. Because obviously the timing of it depends on, how far apart your keyframes are spaced out. Because the program, what it does is, you set your keyframes, and then as you're working in your animation graphs and you're adding tangents to it, the program interpolates, and it adds those in-betweens that you've been wanting. So honestly, the majority bulk, because we're animating pose to pose and not straight ahead, is going to depend on how your keyframes look. So if you wanted to change how far apart your frames actually are, you can select the area that you're not entirely happy with, just marquee select it like this, and you can press this little button on the left hand side of your screen, which is a region tool, and it scales or moves keys. So now if you do this, if you then move this little button, you can see how your graph moves across the frames. And you can even change the height of it. And you can actually edit quite a lot this way. So let's change our timing quickly just for example's sake. And then if you played it, you'll see that it falls much faster than it did previously. And on your timeline, your keyframes would have been adjusted according to how you scaled it. And you can stretch that region out as well, which is going to make it hop slower. And you can honestly just adjust it until you are happy with it. And that's, basically what there is to it. These are the bare basics of animating in Maya. It's literally just a ball bounce. It's a little exercise in the dissipation of energy, the application of different types of tangents to interpolate between your keyframes. It's how to set keyframes, how to freeze transformations, and how to make a ball bounce. That is basically all that has been covered. Like I said, it's the bare minimum, but it's a start. It is a start, and hopefully this has helped in some way, shape, or form.